Okay, well, thanks very much for joining, folks. I think many of you have had the chance to be on other webinars. If you haven't, my name is Leighton Phillips. I'm the founder of SFuels. And maybe before we jump into this, just a big thanks to all of our customers that have helped us to, I guess, start from scratch 5 years ago with our first generation product. But tonight, it's all about our second generation product and some of the technology associated with that. We'll talk also about the practical application of our second gen and what evolves generation on generation. And like I said, I'll walk through some slide content and some of the development work and how we came about with our second gen products and technology, and then we'll open up for Q&A following that. So there'll be plenty of time to have a chat. If we don't get through them all, I'd ask you to put it in the chat. If we can't get it to tonight, we'll make sure we get it through following the webinar. All right, so maybe just to begin, one of the things we want to be very upfront about is that our principles of how we started SFuels and our rationale around nutrition for sport of right fuel, right time remains unchanged. And our construct around going longer in the spirit of performance in the moment, meaning in racing, but also going longer in terms of longevity of our health, those principles remain the same for our continued first to second generation, and we have no intention to shift from that position going forward. In this horizon of the last 5 years, I think it's now north of 300,000 doses of our SFuels first generation product and substrates that we've been working with athletes on all around the world. We're more convinced now than ever on the relevance of timing fuel to intensity to maximize outcomes, and that's both, again, a performance and a longevity in the sports that we enjoy and love. So I do want to kind of start there, and this evolution, if you will, to our second generation technologies is not at all a departure from the principles that we formed the company on and the values that we run it by. I won't spend too much time here, but it maybe just be worthwhile calling out since we began. And in fact, really over the past 12 to 18 months, we've established this leadership team, which I won't go through blow by blow, but our chairman is the chairman of the Mammut and the Watt Bike companies, and he's the chairman of SFuels. I think many of you are familiar with Dr. Dan Plews, and his work with us as our performance technical director. Recently put Dr. Mickey Williden onto our team also, and her background is in sports nutrition specifically, and her papers are specific to low carbohydrate, high fat substrates as it relates to exercise. And then on the business side of the house, Stan Brower, who bought Timex and Garmin and Polar, also worked with some of the other nutrition companies in the industry. He bought those companies, if you will, to national prominence here in the US. And then we have Bertrand working on our finance round. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Bob Babbitt in the media industry for the triathlon endurance segment, and Zach Bitter, the 100-mile world record holder, working with us. Dave Scott continues as a owner and silent partner in the company. And at this point in time, that's our leadership team. We are actually in deep discussions with chief marketing officers and more nutritional capability, if you will, at the organization. And that will be communicated in due course. But that's the makeup of our leadership team. So maybe just to begin, we talk a lot about this right fuel, right time, and many of you on this call will be familiar with that. But in simple terms, all we're really talking about in terms of what that means is, using certain substrates or fuels relative to certain points in time in terms of the intensity of the training or racing. And those different substrates can either accentuate or it can blunten the adaptions of training from a metabolic perspective, depending upon what type of substrate, the timing of it, and as we get into second generation, the critical dosage, if you will, to have an effect. And we'll talk more about that. So that's the what. Now, the why we do that is to really, optimize the use of these different fuels and substrates in the interest of heightening aerobic efficiency, retaining glycogen, slowing the rise of lactate, and all of that in the spirit, on one hand, of performance. And we won't talk too much tonight. There will be a few areas I do talk about it, but we have published blogs and other video material with respect to what this means from a raw healthcare perspective. And we can cover that on a later webinar if you'd like to go deeper on that. But there are videos on our site that talk to that. The basis of right fuel, right time is really what underwrote our first generation substrate or fuel development. And this was back in 2018. We worked with Dan Plews on this as part of our joint campaign going into the Kona World Championships to work out how we would develop a fuel or a substrate that had no glucose in it, and it was non-glycogenic, meaning it didn't stimulate the release of glycogen, and as a function of that, blood sugars were pretty much flat, and as an outcome of that, there was very little to no insulin response. And that is important in the spirit of heightening fat oxidation efficiency. And by having that as the basis of our first gen products, we could then work towards a portfolio of products that would support from low intensity training through to high intensity training and racing. And that was the birth then of Right Fuel, Right Time. And like I mentioned earlier, since that time, we've been validating, that development, which was a fusing between selective medium chain triglycerides and collagen, and we fused them together, and that was the basis of our Train product, our Race Plus product, our Race Plus gel product. All of those were our first generation products and underlying substrate. And we, over the subsequent, I guess it was 5 years, ran 5 validation projects with elite and professional athletes. And these validation projects, some of you may have seen this before, but we were interested in different, if you will, characteristics of how these different substrates would perform with these projects. And on the left-hand side, it began in 2018 in Kona with Dan. And that was more about glycogen preservation. And the examination of that was really trying to understand in the marathon component of the Ironman there, would we see a trailing off of the split times between 1 kilometer split times across the marathon after his swim and the bike. Obviously, we were shooting to establish the course record, all of that, but that was, if you will, secondary to really trying to understand, if you trained this capability, would you have a very robust, stable split times from the beginning of the marathon to the end? And if you want to pull up Dan's data, he's got it on his EndureIQ site. You can see that's exactly what happened. And there was only that day 4 other professional athletes that had a better marathon time than Dan. And if you look at his split times, they were consistent start to the finish, whereas all the pros bar 2 tapered off through that marathon in terms of their split times. We then went and extended that testing from an Ironman format, which is in the, for most people, or for the elites, of course, it's in the 8 hours. For most people, it's probably more in the 12 hours. We went and tested a 100-mile world record with Zach Bitter. This was in the middle of COVID, so unfortunately, formal racing was off. So we had to work with Nordic track, and we actually did this and went for the treadmill world record. We had 2 treadmills that were calibrated side by side. And what we wanted to understand there was if what was valid in a 8-hour, would that be valid if you extended it out 12 hours plus? And Zach went on to execute. So it was like, if you will, 100 miles back to back of 7-minute, I think it was 7-minute 11 or 7-minute 9, thereabouts per mile, 100 back to back 1 miles. And you can look at his fat oxidation rates there, 1.4 grams per minute. He only had 40 grams of carbohydrate per hour during that period of time. What we then did is try to evaluate if this was valid if you went back the other way. So from 100 miles, 11 to 12 hours, right back to sprint triathlon. So we worked with Hayden Wild both for his campaign into the Olympics, the Tokyo Olympics, the Xterra World Championship, and maybe more specifically was the Super League Series, which I'm sure many of you who have followed triathlon would be familiar with that series, which is essentially even shorter than a classic Olympic distance, but it's, if you will, multiple triathlons back to back with maybe, 15, 20 minutes of rest in between these 3 triathlons. And what we were really working on there is specifically carbohydrate oxidation and gastric emptying time, and what specific substrates had rapid, when you've only got these very short races to deal with, the criticality of getting it into this, if you will, blood supply and into the muscle cells quickly is obviously important. We were also working with him on the function of caffeine pre-race, during race. And yeah, he medaled at the Olympics. He became the Xterra World Championship, and he was in fact, he became the #1 WTC triathlete for a period of time there that year and won the overall series for the Super League. We went back to the Ironman and really tried to then understand in Project 4 whether you actually lose power as part of executing. Typically an Ironman, you're sitting somewhere between 70 and 75% VO2 max, and you can be burning a lot of fat there, but there is, an argument out there, we think, frankly, a myth, that you lose power in the process. We tested this with Matt Kerr, both in the labs. I'll show you some of that data soon. But he went from 10.5-hour Ironman to 8.5, sub 8.5-hour Ironman, won the world championship. And this was, I'll show you the data, but basically tripled his fat oxidations while doubling his power on the bike, doubling his wattage. And then the final project, I should say final as it relates to this slide, this whole exercise of running validation project continues, and I'll touch on that in a second. But on the right-hand side is Dan's last race in California, where he sub 8 hours. And he'll be the first to admit this and call this out, that there was a fairly strong current that day in the water. But maybe what is important is his runtime again was 2 hours 50. So across these projects we feel that we understand much better how these different substrates work at these different intensities of racing, these different durations of racing. The projects that we're working on now are specifically with professional marathon runners. So think marathon runners that are in Olympic trials and that type of caliber. One of the nuances that stands out when you look at this chart too is that everything I just talked through was men, and there's a very real aspect and question of this as it relates to women. Dan wrote a paper on applying the same right fuel, right time principles as the lead-in to Chelsea Sodaro's 2022 Ironman World Championship, and that QR code down the bottom there will take you across to that blog paper if you want to read on that particular project, and everything documented. All the lab data is there for Chelsea. Parallel to those validation projects that we were working on, we were also observing third-party research that we had nothing to do with. This was purely, essentially, as whether it was Dan or Mickey or ourselves were looking at what associated research was being published in the same context. And above, in the top half of the screen, is really 5 different research papers that were really calling out a lot of similar observations that we were seeing. On the left-hand side at the top, it was that, the 2 of the most determinant factors of performance outcomes for Ironman triathlon was VO2 max and maximal fat oxidation. And then the second one was really, in fact, this was, research conducted by Dan and his team, really understanding different substrate use, if you will, going into a training session or going into a race, what the implications are for how your body metabolizes different substrates during the training or during racing. And basically calling out that, high carbohydrate pre-race or pre-workout will have a subsequent blunting effect to fat oxidation efficiency during training or during a race, etc. The middle one here is quite interesting. I think a lot of textbooks for some time have, had the baseline or argument that of physiology that at around 70%, you reach your maximal fat oxidation rate. And after that, if in fact, most texts would suggest that fat oxidation declines to 0. That's probably more an artifact of just the testing methodology. The comment of it going to 0, it actually, in more recent technologies for doing analysis like metabolomics and what have you, it would suggest that it doesn't go to 0 at all. This particular paper in the middle here was just showing that, and this was actually a very high intensity track set of subjects that were studied in the paper. 80% of VO2 max with very high fat, 80% of VO2 max, they were still observing very high fat oxidation rates, and think 1.5 grams per minute, very high. This was actually a crossover study, which makes it even more interesting. They actually moved the subjects from, if you will, one protocol to the other protocol being a more classic high carbohydrate protocol. And they saw by using continuous glucose monitors that within 4 weeks, as the subjects move from a higher fat approach or protocol to a higher carbohydrate protocol, that there were in 30% of cases markers of prediabetes in 4 weeks on the high carbohydrate protocol. And then further to the right, it's just more of this observation around high signatures of fat oxidation being correlated to competitive performance. And actually, this kind of second one from the right is very interesting. This uses this metabolomic technique, which is meaning that rather than do the study, if you will, in labs, it's actually done like in the field of, and in this case, it's UCI Grand Tour level racing, so professional cycling. And what they're doing here is basically extracting blood and looking at all the metabolites in the blood as the cyclist goes through different, stages of I think it was a 7-day or a 6-day race, this particular study. And anyway, the same findings were shown, as that the most competitive of the team that was studied was those that had the highest signatures of fat oxidation efficiency. And the lower part of this particular chart is really just talking to the opposite of that, and research that was going on suggesting that higher carbohydrate consumption in exercise was having actually a detraining effect. So all of the effort that was going into adaptations from aerobic or threshold or VO2 max training was being blunted or diminished by taking on, in a day-to-day context, fructose and glucose, etc. And I will talk more about this at the end, because the nuance here is in the amount and the consistency, and we'll talk more about that, like I say, as we get into this. But I think what's important to call out here is that consistent intake is really having a detraining effect, and predominantly coming from effects to mitochondrial, either what would have been a genesis or a creation of more density of mitochondria, or the efficiency of mitochondria, and also some of the enzymes associated with actually moving both glucose and fatty acids across cell membranes into the mitochondria to be oxidized. Those things are being blunted and diluted by overconsumption. This is just a chart that when we go to develop from our first gen products to our second generation products, the chart I just showed you, and then this one and the next one, is having a lot of bearing on further optimization of our substrates in order to maximize metabolic efficiency for an endurance athlete. This is actually a athlete with fairly weak metabolism. So what you're looking on the left here is that as the x-axis is power, in this case on a bike, so wattage, and what they're showing here is that as you go from left to right and the wattage or the intensity increases, that the dependency on carbohydrate ramps dramatically. And subsequently, even at these very low power levels, so like 150, 160 watts, fat oxidation is, extremely low as a percentage of contribution to energy supporting the physical activity. Now, if the exercise was, if the competitive target event was just a 1 hour event, you may actually get away with this in the spirit of having sufficient glycogen in the liver and the muscle to handle this type of metabolism. Accepting that on the right-hand side, the parallel activity that goes on when you ramp carbohydrate so fast is also that your lactate levels also ramp that fast. And this is important just to put in the back of your minds too. We had a ride on the weekend and a bunch of chat going on the ride. And one of the athletes was just talking about using a lot of carbohydrate, and that got them by. And in the spirit of, like I said, a short event, meaning sub 2 hours, certainly, it won't be so much a lack of substrate, meaning in muscle or in liver. But what you will find is that as they, ramp consumption of carbohydrate, that you will begin to see also a heightened lactate. And this is not something SFuels is promoting. I think if you listen to Inigo San Milan, like the performance physiologists of some of the grand cycling teams, they will talk to this too. And this phenomenon where you can actually spike lactate by overconsumption of carbohydrate. You'll also see this, by the way, in diabetic patients, where even at rest, you'll find that they have a heightened lactate level in the spirit of their metabolism. Now, this is all an example of a weak metabolism, and then when you train it, this is what it looks like. This is the same charts of another athlete. On the left is before, and these green dots here is the ramp of their, like as a percentage of contribution or energy contribution. The green dots is coming from carbohydrate, and this orange yellow dots is coming from fat. And what this is saying here on the left, before we started to work with them, about 50% of their, at around 150 watts, 50% of the fat of the energy is coming from fat and 50% from energy. When you get out to 80% of energy contribution here, you're at 250 watts. That's 80% is all coming from carbohydrate, 20% from fat. And then when we worked with the athlete to optimize them on our first gen technologies, we were able to shift that from now at 300 watts, 80% coming from fat and 20% coming from carbohydrate. And they were doing that, like I said, here at 50%, it was at about 150, say 160 watts, where out here they were producing 100 of the energy. 1.8 grams per minute came from fat, and that was being done at 300 watts. So there is nuance to that, and that is, and I want to be, very transparent. This is not at all just about the substrate. This athlete spent a lot of time in zone 2, a lot of time in fasted zone 2, long duration rides to establish this level of efficiency. But I want to highlight that it wasn't at the cost of losing wattage and power on the bike. So this was all with respect to our first generation. Everything I've talked about today is just to give you context to the basis that we were coming from in terms of thinking about evolving our first generation substrate and fuels into a next generation set of products. I won't go into our research methodology, excepting to say that we try to run this TikTok methodology where you have I'll say a talk, which is like a major update, if you will, to the technology that we're working. And then once you establish that, there may be some minor refinements or a tick. And you'll continue to, advance the technology of the substrate over time by having those major inflection points of evolution. And then you'll have some refinements. Refinements could be as simple as texture improvement, taste improvement. But what we're talking about with a generational change going from first to second generation is like a major update in terms of how we're working with the substrate. And these were in the white text here on the right, what we were looking to try to, both in research and as we developed the substrate fuel for our second gen products, these are the physiologic functions that we were looking for in choosing specific nutrients and bringing them together into a new fuel that we would use in our second gen products. There are some additional characteristics here. We want it to be taste-free, water-soluble, simplified for dosing, and some simplification to help just the application of it in training and racing. But from a functional perspective, it's these pieces, maximizing, like what we talked about earlier, either increasing the density of mitochondria or improving the fat oxidation efficiency or the lipolysis, the breakdown of fat. And then specifically, we've done a lot of work in this version on this generation, of enhancing gut resilience. So the substrate itself will build resilience in the gut. And this is obviously important for any of you who've been around endurance racing for a while. You know that this is one of the big factors of not finishing these races is gut issues. We, for some time, have actually used some of the nutrient in our second gen substrate in some of our other products, like our Revival product and its role in inflammation. There is some ongoing work that we have not yet really, if you will, put our brand behind, but we're still evaluating it. The same nutrients we're using in our second gen substrate, some research would suggest it has a very interesting role in immune resilience, and we've still got more work to really be comfortable in advocating that. But nevertheless, that would be a very interesting function, obviously, for endurance athletes. So we refer to this second gen substrate as extended substrate. And what is it? Well, it's fusing the same medium chain. We selected 2 specific medium chain triglycerides, octanoic acid, or C8, and decanoic acid, which is C10. And we took those 2 medium chain triglycerides and we fused them to glutamine, which is an amino acid. And together, that is just, in a natural context, it's just a white powder. And you put it into water and it dissolves. It's tasteless. But functionally, what the research would say of these nutrients is these are non-glycogenic, meaning that they're not triggering a spike in blood sugar, a spike in insulin, and therefore blunting fat oxidation. But on the contrary, these particular nutrients would trigger and support mitochondrial biogenesis, lipolysis, fat oxidation, both the retention of glycogen and also accelerated replenishment of glycogen in the muscle tissue. And then from a gut perspective, looking at how these particular nutrients actually accelerate when they're sitting side by side carbohydrate, they actually accelerate the absorption of carbohydrate out of the gut into the blood supply. And then specifically, like I just mentioned, how do these nutrients actually build resilience by improving the integrity of the membrane? And as I mentioned, we're still looking at the immune side of things. So our focus with all of this is really to, as you train the different zones or the different intensities and metabolic capabilities from an energy system, this is meant to twofold: work on aerobic capacity on one hand, and secondly, as you extend aerobic capacity into higher intensities, being able to more efficiently use or store or retain glycogen, and by using more fat versus glucose, not be as heightened in terms of lactate production. And I've mentioned about gut resilience. So this is, I think you've probably seen it online. We talk about these 3 products. At the face value, we're trying to simplify the application by using, I think, fairly standard terminology across the athlete community by referring to the zones. Obviously, getting further promoted by wearables, wearable technologies. But yeah, essentially, our Zone 2 product being an aerobic training fuel, our Zone 4 being a threshold high-intensity training and racing fuel, and then our highest intensity racing gel product for racing. And I'm going to talk specifically about each of these in a second, but maybe just to give generation on generation, like what actually changed and what actually improved. And we've sat over the past, I guess, 2 months, we've sat with, I guess it's about 20 coaches, about 15 professional elite athletes, and talk them through this so they can understand the application. And it's really simplifying the application by evolving from our first gen to our second gen. So our first gen products at the top, which you're probably familiar with: Train, the Race Plus drink, and the gel powder. So at the highest level, the Zone 2 is a Zone 2 is a hydration powder mixed into a drink. Zone 4 is a powder that you mix into a drink, and Zone 5 is a off-the-shelf, ready-to-go gel. By using extended substrate, we can get into the nutrient dosage levels that can support those metabolic functions or physiologic functions I referred to earlier. Aerobic development, threshold efficiency, reduced lactate, and then gut resilience. And the reason that can be brought about is twofold. One is extended substrate. Like on the Train product, we can increase the glutamine by 12x, 12 times. So you really get into these functional dosages, where before it was bound to collagen. We take the collagen out and we've fused it now to the glutamine. So you can have these, much more functional dosages of glutamine in a training fuel while you're training. In the Race Plus product, in the same dose amount, we double the carbohydrate to a fairly industry standard 30 grams per dose. And then we quadruple the glutamine in that from our extended substrate. And then in our gel, our Zone 5 product, we 8 times the glutamine and we 5 to 6 times the carbohydrate. So I think the key takeaway is just, I think the word we typically are calling this out is just the efficiency of extended substrate to get into these functional dosages to really have that effect on improving adaptions, whether it's in aerobic or threshold or within racing, or support the gut in high intensity training and racing. The all of our training products, meaning our Zone 2 and Zone 4 products, are all fructose free. And this is where I start to delineate, and we've got a slide on this in a second, but in the spirit of training and trying to use these not just to fuel for training, but actually to help trigger and support the adaptions and to build gut resilience, using these on a daily basis is important. But if that was with fructose, that would have a detraining effect. So as I said, Zone 2 and Zone 4, we use no fructose. We use different dextrins, both a highly branched cyclic dextrin and maltodextrin, characteristically extremely similar, except that the HBCD is treated with an enzyme and it branches it. All that has is a slight improved characteristic of how it empties from the gut. It's a little faster than straight maltodextrin. So we have a mix of those two. And then in the gel powder, we have 5 different substrates. So we have our extended substrate, which has 3 different fuels inside of it. And then we have fructose and maltodextrin. I'll talk more about that in a second. And it's very dense. So in the palm of your hand, 300 calories. By bringing out the collagen from our first generation product and replacing that with glutamine, for those either desiring to have a vegetarian or vegan compliant product, it is. And we are in the process of all of these products going through full Inform Sport compliance. We used to run testing on our first generation products, but in the second generation, it will be both tested and it will be stamped using the Inform Sport compliance marks. And all of these now are available in single form factors for convenience, and that's what retail has asked for. So let's talk a little bit about starch and fructose. I just put here, I think, 3 of the more pertinent either videos or blogs that we've produced over the past several years, where we've brought out some of the implications of, let's just say, firstly, high carbohydrate, and then secondly, specifically fructose. On the left-hand side is a video we did back in 2017. And what it showed was using glucose monitoring post-race. It takes about 2 weeks for your blood glucose regulation to get back to what it was pre-race. Now, there's an element of this which is just the raw stress of the race itself that it places on the hormonal system. And also, obviously, in racing where just quite intense amounts of carbohydrate are consumed. All of these things, as you can see in this chart here, which is, it's just a screen capture, you're better to hit the QR code and go and watch the video. But Dan talks through, what would typically be a sub, 5 millimole measure of blood glucose would be, sitting quite a bit higher than that for a 2-week period, and then it would come back to its pre-race norm. So there's a degree of difficult to maintain perfect regulation when we throw our bodies into these, pretty stressful race situations. The other takeaway is that, starches, maltodextrin, highly branched cyclic dextrin, their exit time from the gut is, like I said earlier, fairly similar. That's not the case for glucose. Glucose actually is quite a bit slower. And you'll still find it in products on the market. It's cheap, but it is in the spirit of what we're trying to achieve, to get it through the gut fairly rapidly and then get it absorbed quickly. It's really quite materially slow. And I'm not talking here about seconds. I'm talking about 10 minutes difference compared to the maltodextrins. But, as we get into these higher intensity training sessions, either to develop our thresholds, meaning anaerobic threshold or what have you, clearly the body begins to shift its ratio of substrate to more carbohydrate. And, we do that to build that adaptation of being able to handle those high intensities, and also just to test in a race simulation how our body and our gut, handles that. So it needs to be done. But of course, the poor timing would be is that if we use that fructose, particularly on a daily basis, there are both acute issues with that, like I mentioned earlier, whereby it has this detraining effect, and it has an effect on the gut membrane in terms of its integrity. And then obviously, if you were to search online on overconsumption of fructose, you'll be overwhelmed as it relates to chronic disease outcomes associated with that. And then, on appropriate timing, like the video I did in April 2023, where we actually looked at multiple different fueling strategies and, looked at the research, and you can hit the QR code and go and watch this. We highlight that fructose has a very real role in raising the ceiling, if you will, on the amount of carbohydrate that can be oxidized in a given amount of time. And this, this research began quite a long time ago, like, early 2000s. And they were showing back then that you definitely hit a cap on just glucose, meaning even if you have starch, it digests to glucose. And that is around 1 gram per minute. However, if you add fructose to that, you can add another, 0.5 to 0.7 of a gram per minute to also oxidize. So on race day, if for most people, the name of the game is about performance, being a key race day objective, it is absolutely true that if you were to add fructose on top of a starch, you will have a heightened oxidation, substrate oxidation ceiling. You'll have more substrate to be able to oxidize per minute. I'll say all that, but I'll put the caveat that you still have to train the body in order to do that. So it's important that, while we're saying not to be taking fructose every day in the way of concentrated gels, don't be confused that whole foods has plenty of fructose in it. Obviously, fruits do, but even some of your more even blander vegetables still have fructose in it. So those enzymes involved with breaking down and oxidizing fructose, just because you don't take it in the form of a highly concentrated gel, it doesn't mean that your body doesn't have the enzymes associated with handling fructose. One final caveat I would say is that I think the current research would suggest that there is absolutely a fructose intolerance that is in the community. It's about 1 in every 20,000 to 30,000 people who have a true fructose intolerance. So it is true, it is out there. So what does this look like in application? This chart is really just a evolved chart from our usage guide, our get started guide. The use of our primed carnitine and caffeine to upregulate and prime, if you will, fat oxidation efficiency. And then in training, depending upon whether we're doing slow, long distance aerobic work, we would use our Zone 2 products. And then if we're using high intensity, tempo, interval type workouts, etc., we would use our Zone 4 product. Similar to first generation, there is a period of time required or encouraged before you begin the use of the Zone 4 products that you would not consume any carbohydrate or not consume the Zone 4 product. And that's about 30 minutes. So you would, before the training session, have the primed drink. For the first 30 minutes, you can either continue to sip on the primed drink, and then after that, you can begin to use the Zone 4. And all that's doing is it takes around about 30, depending upon the intensity, they say between 30 and 60 minutes, but it takes that long for the channels in the muscle cells to open up in an insulin-independent way and allow the glucose to come in without insulin. And that's important because in that state, if you will, we can both be most efficiently oxidizing fat because we haven't produced the insulin, and we can be bringing glucose into the muscle cell to be oxidized. So you've got this sequential, simultaneous oxidation of very efficient fat and carbohydrate oxidation happening at once. I won't talk tonight about our recovery and revival products. We can spend another webinar if you'd like to go deep on that. Let us know. We'd be happy to take your feedback on that. I did want to, though, talk to racing. This is the same in terms of how we've advocated the use of primed on race day, which is more one before the race as a cognitive function, and then in the first, typically hour of the race. Obviously in a triathlon, that's after you swim. In marathon, ultra running, etc., that's in that first hour of the run of the race. Another 2 doses. This is fairly simplified. All it's suggesting here is to have a certain level of caffeine and carnitine in the blood, and at that level, you can further upregulate your fat oxidation even further by taking that kind of dosage. And it's in the form of around 2.5 to 3 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight. If you want more material or just the background of all of that, if you download on our site our fueling guide, it's a 20-page document, and it will give you all of those details in there. And then choosing your fuels is just a matter of, what your preference is, if you will, during a race, whether it's on the bike. Obviously, a fuel that's in a drink format is fairly common. So that's our Zone 4 product. And the nuance here compared to our first gen would be that you would, take between 1 and 2 serves per hour. So that would be 30 grams to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour. Or if you like the gel format on the bike or obviously on the run, that already has 60 grams per hour. So we've simplified the dosage, application in our second gen products to make it much more simple. Like I said, you can download what you just saw on that practical application, which is this get started guide here, and then the fueling guide is a 20-page document. That QR code on the right will give you those 2 documents. If you haven't had a chance to see both Dan and Mickey talking on, I think it's 5 separate videos. They're only about a minute each or thereabouts. And that QR code, that will take you through to those videos to learn more. So with that, folks, thanks very much for joining, and all the best for your racing this year, and look forward to catch up soon. Thanks for all your support from SFuels.